evening to this webinar that is dedicated to clarifications and FAQs of the 7th call of the NAMA facility. We, that is the Technical Support Unit of the NAMA facility, in short TSU, are pleased to see the high number of participants from all over the world who are now attending. We thank you all for joining us today and extend a very warm welcome to each of you. My name is Johanna Riedmann. I am a desk officer at the TSU and I have the pleasure to moderate today's webinar. Please keep in mind that this webinar is on record. This is the third out of 3 webinars to provide information on the submission of project outlines for the 7th call of the NAMA facility. The objective of today's webinar is to address clarifications on FAQs regarding the 7th call, the selection criteria, and steps required to submit a project outline. On this slide, you can see our TSU colleagues who are involved in today's webinar. Starting on the left is Rita, followed by Janka, myself, and Alexandra. Alexandra takes care of the technical functioning of our webinar. Rita and Janka will guide us through the content of this webinar, while I will be moderating the webinar and will address your questions during the Q&A sessions. Before we dive into the content of the webinar, let me hand over to Janka to give a quick introduction into technical features of our webinar.
Thank you, Johanna, and hello, everyone. For those that have not followed in fact, our webinars in the past, you might have noticed that we have changed the technical setup a bit, as we use now Skype for Business and Slido for this webinar. Let me quickly introduce you to some technical features. First, you might have seen that we have disabled the chat function here in this Skype for Business. This is to avoid distraction during the presentation. There's an alternative, which I will address in a second. Here on that screen on number 2, you will find a button that allows you to view the webinar in full screen. Now, you are warmly invited to pose your questions during this webinar. How to do this? We offer 2 ways. One is via Slido. For this, please open a new window in your browser, type in slido.com and enter the event number 54218. Enter your name and email address, and then you are all set to send us your questions. Your question will only be seen by us, the host of the webinar. There's of course also the option that you simply send us an email with your question, whatever works best for you. You will find this Slido event number and our email address on each of the slides. We will answer the questions in the Q&A sessions today, so please submit them beforehand. In case that there are more questions than we can answer today, we will reply to those questions in our upcoming clarification notes and publish them on our website. The recording of this webinar will be published on our website within the next days. In this webinar's presentation, there are also several links for the websites and sources of information. This will be available and working in the uploaded presentation that we will publish together with the recording of this webinar. So that's for the technical features. Back to you, Johanna.
Thank you, Janka. Let's first have a look at the overview of today's agenda. In a moment, Rita will provide you with an introduction to the NAMA facility. She will summarize some learnings from our 2 other webinars for the 7th call and give an input on how COVID-19 will influence the 7th call. Janka will then present in the next, second part, details on selection criteria, transformational change, and mitigation of potential. After each part, we will have time for some Q&As. Please submit your questions via slido.com as they arise to you. As Janka already mentioned, if we do not manage to respond all of the incoming questions today during this webinar, we will certainly follow up and publish our responses as part of our clarification rounds. And of course, we will inform you individually on the responses. Now, let's turn to the first part of today's agenda, where Rita will briefly introduce you to the NAMA facility.
Thank you, Johanna. First, we will have a quick look at what the NAMA facility supports and offers. The NAMA facility provides financial support for implementing national climate strategies and nationally determined contributions via mitigation actions such as nationally appropriate mitigation actions. These actions are to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions in relevant sectors, thereby realizing sustainable transformational change towards a carbon neutral pathway. This is done through funding NAMA support projects, in short NSPs, as the most ambitious parts of these mitigation actions that have the potential to catalyze transformational change towards carbon neutral development in the overall sector. With this objective in mind, the donors of the NAMA facility decided to hold open competitive calls for NSP outlines and select the most ambitious, innovative and promising NSPs for funding. In line with this strategy, the NAMA facility has no regional or sector focus. The level of ambition is assessed in the individual country context. So, what mitigation actions are we looking for precisely to support? Supported mitigation actions should demonstrate that they are country-led and embedded in national development strategies and plans. They should also demonstrate how they are integrated into sector-wide programs or policies and refer specifically to the country's NDC context. For inducing a transformational change in the sector, supported mitigation actions should tackle wider policy, regulatory, or other barriers that currently limit or constrain investments into carbon-neutral development. The NSP should also have an innovative, self-sustaining financing mechanism that attracts investment. Next, we will revisit the eligibility criteria. In addition to the obvious requirements of a timely submission, completeness of documents, and submission of documents in English, NSPs have to have the following characteristics in order to be eligible. The requested funding volume from the NAMA facility should be in the range of 5 to 20 million euros. NSPs have to have a detailed preparation phase of either 10 or 15 months. The implementation period should be between 3 and 5.5 years. In addition, NSP funding and associated investments must qualify as official development assistance throughout the implementation period of the NSP. The country of implementation must be listed on the OECD DAC list. Lastly, the additionality of the NSP is also considered an eligibility criterion. This means that NSPs are not eligible for funding if they cannot demonstrate their additionality to previous, ongoing, and/or planned public and private interventions. Let us now have a look at the main changes between the 6th and the 7th call. The General Information Document and application documents have undergone a minor revision for the 7th call. These revisions build on the feedback provided by and the lessons learned from previous NSP application and selection processes. The following changes have been introduced. The NAMA facility supports now developing countries and emerging economies in their efforts to shift to carbon-neutral development pathways. This new approach raises the NAMA facility ambition level compared with that of the past, which had targeted support for low-carbon development pathways in partner countries. This change ensures that the NAMA facility responds to the increased push to limit global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Another change that has been introduced is a phased approach to NSP implementation, in which NSPs are expected to secure all relevant contracts to the NSP's FC and TC operationalization within the first 18 months. This is supposed to ensure that sufficient progress is achieved in the early stages of the implementation phase. The eligible implementation time has also been extended to 5.5 years from 5 years. The NSP outline template and annexes were also slightly revised to simplify the application and provide more guidance. For example, Annex 6 on the GHG mitigation potential has been revised to provide further clarity and guidance and offer a more consistent presentation of the mitigation potential. All these changes are also further outlined in Annex 1 of the GAD.
Thank you, Rita, for the brief overview. Before going into the update on COVID-19, I would like to remind you that the information covered just by Rita is also found in the 7th call General Information Document of the NAMA facility. This document is the central source of information for the 7th call. Its purpose is to assist applicants in preparing and submitting NAMA support project outlines. We also provide French and Spanish translations on our website. Since today we will keep it as concise as possible, please take a look as we cannot cover all the details in this webinar. You will find an overview of all relevant documents at the end of the presentation. Please keep in mind to ask questions. After the next part, we will have our first Q&A session. Please remember to submit any question that may arise using slido.com. Now, TSU has been monitoring the implications of COVID-19 on the 7th call, and I think there's some news for potential applicants. Rita, please share them with our audience.
Thank you, Johanna. The TSU conducted an anonymous survey in June 2020 among potential applicants in order to better understand the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on the preparation of outlines. Based on the received feedback, the NAMA facility took the decision to introduce several changes to the 7th call. First, let us have a look at the changes related to the timeline. The deadline for submitting 7th call NSP outlines was extended until 30th of September 2020 at 3 p.m. Central European Summer Time. Also, we will offer one additional round of clarification in September. The clarification notes number 6 will be published on the 22nd of September. However, as we are well aware of the fact that climate action cannot wait until the pandemic is over, the NAMA facility will do its best and work with a tighter timeline for the assessment process to remain within the originally foreseen schedule for donors' decision in the selection process. That means that the decision on funding for the detailed preparation phase of your NSP would still be taken at the latest in April 2021. In addition to these changes related to the timeline, 2 changes related to the documents to be submitted were introduced. The NAMA facility enables NSPs to explain the specific circumstances arising from the COVID-19 pandemic in an additional optional Annex 7 to the NSP outline. This will enable the NAMA facility during the assessment process to better understand and consider the country-specific implications on the NSP application, its ambition and state of preparation. There will be also some flexibility regarding the endorsement by national ministries, as the NAMA facility accepts in this call emails from national government officials confirming support to the NSP. The actual endorsement letter should, however, be presented at the latest during a potential in-depth assessment. The general information document and the set of application documents were also updated to reflect these changes.
Thank you, Rita, for this. Let's take some time to respond to a couple of questions pouring in from our audience in our first Q&A session. So there was one question coming in and somebody wants to know what the funding range for the DPP phase is. Janka, do you want to answer this one?
Yes, I'll take that question. Thank you, Johannes. So the NAMA facility does not set a range or an upper limit for the DPP funding, but let the applicants propose or request the funding and determine how much they would need for the preparation. Please, however, note that and the average in the previous calls has been approximately 250,000 euro that has been proposed by the applicants. Please note that the range or the volume requested is of course also kind of an indicator of the NSP on their readiness in terms of what still needs to be done until the NSP is ready for implementation. So we do look at it for the appropriateness of the requested funding, and that will be assessed on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you. There is actually a question related to the endorsement from the government. Rita, you had mentioned the issue of endorsement letters when you talked about changes due to COVID-19. The question is it sufficient to get an endorsement from an environmental unit within a line ministry, or does the NAMA facility require the endorsement from the Ministry of Environment? Rita?
So, assuming that the Ministry of Environment in that country is responsible for climate change mitigation and the UNFCCC negotiations, we would definitely require endorsement from that ministry as well, and not just a line ministry. But as already mentioned, we do understand that signed letters are difficult to obtain during the pandemic with lockdowns in various countries. So therefore, the donors of the NAMA facility agreed to initially accept emails from government officials from the relevant ministries where they express the support to the NSP, and the endorsement letter, the actual one from the ministry, would then be requested in case the NSP is shortlisted for an in-depth assessment in early next year. I hope this helps.
Okay, thank you, Rita. So let's look at some other questions. So another question is, are countries prioritized that have not yet received any funding in the previous calls? Janka, do you mind answering this question?
Not at all. So the answer is no. As Rita mentioned before, the NAMA facility has no regional or country group specific focus, but continues to select the most ambitious yet feasible NSPs, where each NSP is assessed on its own merits. But noting that it seems to be a bit challenging for SIDS, so small island development states, and LDCs, least developed countries, to access finance such as the NAMA facility, we would at this occasion also highlight the fact that the NAMA facility, of course, very much appreciates applications from these countries, from SIDS and LDCs.
Okay, thank you, Janka. There's another question about the application process. Can we receive feedback on our project idea or specific annexes before the 7th call submission deadline? I'm going to answer this myself. Unfortunately, this is not possible. In line with the NAMA facility's policies and clarifications, the TSU does not provide any individual advice on project concepts. This is why we ensure transparent and fair competition among all potential applicants. Maybe another question, is it necessary for the NSP outline to be directly linked to a specific NAMA? Janka, do you mind?
No, I don't mind. So no, despite its name, the NAMA facility, we support a wide range of mitigation actions, including sector programs and initiatives, as long as they are in line with the country's NDC, so nationally determined contributions, and as long as they are endorsed by the national government. We don't really care whether there is a NAMA label on the NAMA.
Okay, thank you, Janka. There is another listener who is asking if projects with a focus on social and post-COVID-19 recovery issues that also support low-carbon developments are prioritized in the selection process. Rita?
So the NAMA facility's focus is on supporting the implementation of mitigation actions, of course. But as we're looking for NSPs that have the potential to trigger transformational change towards carbon neutral development pathways, significant co-benefits, so that would be social, economic, and environmental co-benefits, they are considered as important drivers for transformational change. So in short, while the focus of the NSP should be on mitigation action, social and other co-benefits are, of course, positively evaluated as part of the potential for transformational change.
Okay, thank you. There's one question. Is there a certain hierarchical level that the endorsement email need to be sent by? So, for example, head of department or higher. Janka, do you mind answering this one?
I will take that one as well. So there is we don't provide the guidance, but however, we do, of course, look for who is signing or is signaling the support from the national ministry. So that is part of our assessments when we look at the endorsement letters or emails.
Okay, thank you. So maybe one more question for this round. Are individual investment projects considered for funding if they fit into the country's mitigation action? Rita, could you answer this one?
Yeah, sure. So the NAMA facility supports governments and their implementing partners in implementing sector-wide or also sub-sector-wide mitigation actions, rather than single investment projects, such as, for example, one solar PV plant or the refurbishment of a single building. So the NSP must be transformational in nature, including elements of replicability and scalability.
Okay, thank you, Rita, and thanks to everyone for this first round of questions. So moving on, let's take a deep dive to the selection criteria that the NAMA facility applies. And Janka, I understand that we will focus on two very essential criteria, namely transformational change and the mitigation potential of projects.
Yes, Johanna, this is correct. And thanks for the floor again. So our audience might recall that we in the NAMA facility apply 3 types of selection criteria. First, we look at the eligibility of submissions. This includes the formal set of criteria that Rita has mentioned earlier, but also the eligibility of the applicants and the additionality of a project. But then we are, of course, most interested in the contents of the proposed NAMA support projects, or NSP. To assess the contents, we look at the project's ambition to trigger actual transformational change in the country, the potential to leverage additional finance, and to achieve a relevant mitigation effect. As ambitious concepts would not help our climate, of course, if they are not implemented, we also look at the feasibility of the NSP. We do want to understand whether the proposed mitigation actions can be really implemented within the next 5-6 years and will have the promised effects. For this, we look, for instance, at the rationale and the project design, but also at the concept that lays out the detailed preparation phase. Unfortunately, today in this webinar, we have not the time to take a detailed look at all the criteria, but only at the ambition criteria of transformational change and mitigation potential. I strongly recommend our listeners to check out the 7th call General Information Document, GID, because in Chapter 5 you will include, you will see the complete selection criteria. Now, I promised you that we take a closer look at the selection criteria of transformational change. And for this, let's first get a common understanding of how the NAMA facility defines this. Transformational change is a catalytic change in systems and behaviors resulting from disruptive climate actions that enable actors to shift to carbon neutral pathways. In essence, this reflects that we need to act very quickly to change on a large scale of how we act, how we invest, how we take decisions in order to remain within the 1.5 degree objective of the Paris Agreement. For NSPs to trigger transformational change, we do need a strong national ownership. The actions need to be in line with the Paris Agreement and the country's nationally determined contributions. The impact must go beyond the individual projects or interventions, and the support mechanisms should trigger a self-reinforcing dynamic and prevent reversion. So reversion flipping back to the status quo. And of course, transformational change also requires an incremental learning process that allows a fearless learning. If that still sounded a bit abstract, then let's take a look at the next slides that might help you to better understand what we look for during our assessments of outlines. So first, to look at the national ownership, and that was mentioned before, we look at the endorsement letters and commitment in these letters from the national ministries. The line ministry, so the sector ministry, and the Ministry for Climate Change. We also look for whether all key national implementing partners are on board to make the changes in the sector. Then we look at whether the NSP is in line with the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. For this, we look at whether the sector is relevant in terms of national emissions. And we also look at whether it supports the implementation of the NDC or even goes beyond to increase the ambition level in the NDCs. When looking at whether an NSP has the potential, an impact beyond the individual projects or interventions, we look at whether it is embedded in a mitigation agenda of the respective sector. So is there a national policy action plan in place, or even a legal framework in place? We look at whether there's a relevant scope of the NSP intervention, because we know that if the scope is too small, it simply will go unnoticed and there will be no transformational change in the sector. And then we also look at whether this NSP really has the opportunity or the potential to scale and replicate at national or regional level. So when we look at mechanisms that trigger the self-reinforcing dynamic and prevent the reversion, we look, for instance, on whether there are relevant co-benefits associated with the action that could trigger a transformation beyond the NSP scope. We look also at whether the NSP would overcome systematic barriers to mitigation in the sector, or whether it is in fact just working around key barriers. And if needed, we also would like to see that that relevant regulation or policy is put in place to reduce the future GHG emissions. We always ask ourselves whether the NSP is accelerating development or initiates a reversed flow of funds or change in behavior. And last but not least, does the NSP, or is the change of the NSP sustainable, that is irreversible and significant beyond the NSP intervention? So before we move on to look at the mitigation potential, I want to reiterate here that the support of transformational change really is a central key feature of NAMA facility support. Please feel strongly invited to look at our subpage dedicated to the subject transformational change that will provide you with further reading and guidance on this topic. Now, as mentioned earlier, we also want to look at the mitigation potential today. Let's take a few minutes for this topic. You have already heard from Rita that we completely revised Annex 6 on the mitigation potential and also the relevant sections in our outline template. We did this to help you and guide you in providing all essential data that we need to understand what are your underlying assumptions, how did you calculate, and of course, what is the actual emission reductions expected from the proposed intervention. In the end, this is exactly also what we will assess. So we do look at the underlying assumptions, ask, are they transparent? Are they plausible? Is the methodology robust? And is the input data and our input data and sources reliable? We look at whether the mitigation scenario is built on a realistic timeline. So, for instance, assuming that an NSP can already have a significant mitigation effect in the very first year, this seems very challenging and, from our point of view, in most cases unrealistic, as the project is just about to start. And we also wonder, or are looking forward, look at the question of whether there's a risk of rebound effects or leakage, and if yes, how the NSP addresses this. And then, of course, we also look at the calculations and the results, so at the direct mitigation potential. And there we are looking for whether the potential or the effect would be significant. And for the indirect effect, we also, we pose the same question. Is the effect significant? And here, for the indirect potential, I would like to remind you to really make an effort to do the calculations, because in the past projects, we have seen that at several occasions, NSPs did not submit any data, and by this, they scored somewhat lower in our assessments. So be strongly encouraged to present the indirect mitigation potential as well. And then last but not least, we also look at the cost effectiveness of the direct mitigation potential. And there we are comparing the direct mitigation potential with the funding requested from the NAMA facility. Our general and very strong recommendation to all applicants is go for the more conservative methodologies, assumptions, sources, data. This will be very much appreciated during our assessment. Also note that as the NSPs are selected, amongst others, based on the mitigation effect that they promise in the initial NSP outline, if such an NSP later on significantly decreases its emission reductions, for instance, during the detailed preparation phase or during the implementation phase. This might cause some serious hiccups and even might risk to a discontinuation of support from the NAMA facility. So as I mentioned before, we are providing you with a completely revised template to present the mitigation figures, and to further help you filling in this Annex 6, we also produced a 26-minute podcast on this topic, and that on the annex that walks you through the different sheets in the table and also presents you a fictitious example from the energy efficiency sector, so that you get an idea of what to fill in where. You will find the link to this podcast in the uploaded recording of this webinar, and of course it's already available on our website. And maybe also good to know for you, we are currently developing a second example for this Annex 6, and this time it's going to be an example from the agricultural sector. Of course, this will be also published on our website. With this, that was a long part, I would like to close our brief excursion into the selection criteria and encourage you to take a look at the general information document to find more details on the other criteria. Now, back to you, Johanna.
Wow. Thank you, Janka. So much information. Some of our listeners already came up with some questions regarding what was just explained. Maybe one question here. What are the details for the endorsement letter? Should this letter state the endorsement of the ministry to the DPP phase or also of the implementation phase? Rita, maybe you could answer this one.
Yeah, so the endorsement we are looking for is the endorsement to the entire NSP. So that would include both the DPP and the implementation phase. And answering the first part of the question, which is what kind of details should be included there. That is, for that you will find some guidance in the Annex 1, which is related to the endorsement letters, where we list aspects that should be considered in the governmental endorsement letters. But of course, the government is entirely free to formulate the letter as they deem it appropriate.
Okay. Thank you, Rita. Maybe one more question about the mitigation potential as well. So, for example, this one, does the greenhouse gas mitigation achieved through TC technical cooperation activities implemented during the NSP implementation count as direct or indirect mitigation? Maybe, Janka, you can take up this one.
Thank you, and I would volunteer, yes, indeed, for answering this question. So, the greenhouse gas mitigation achieved through technical cooperation activities, so TA activities, counts in our logic as indirect mitigation, irrespective of whether this has been being achieved during or after the NSP lifetime. Only emission reductions that are achieved by measures partially or completely financed or leveraged by the financial cooperation would be counted, and that is achieved during the NSP period. For instance, the amount of houses, energy efficient houses built, or acres or trees planted within the NSP implementation period would be counted as direct mitigation. And just for your information, also the Annex 6 guides you through what should be counted as direct and what as indirect mitigation effect.
Thank you, Janka. One more question, maybe. In the case that there's no official country baseline, can we use another study produced by, for example, NGOs to build the indicators for our NAMA proposal? Rita, how would you respond to this question?
Yeah, this is possible. You might also check for whether, for example, in other countries with a similar setting, such baselines have maybe already been developed, and you could also use them as a reference. So simply choose the most accurate data you can obtain.
Okay, thank you, Rita. Another question was, if the NAMA facility gives a guidance on how much of the resulting greenhouse gas mitigation can be claimed by the country as domestic mitigation action? Janka, do you mind?
I'll do my best, thank you. So the resulting mitigation from the NSP can be accounted and claimed by the country as the domestic mitigation action throughout the NSP and also beyond the NSP lifetime. That is, the donor countries will not claim these for their own mitigation targets.
Okay, thank you, Anka. One more question came in. Can transformational change of a sector be focused on a sub-national level rather than at the sector at national level? Maybe I can answer this one myself. So NSPs might propose to focus their work on a certain, like a relevant sub-national level to enhance their impact from their TC and FC, so technical cooperation and financial cooperation. However, it will be important to demonstrate how these impacts are fed into the national level and how the NSP, along with its national implementing partners, enables upscaling and replication at national level. So, thank you so much for all your questions. Before we move on in the agenda, let me quickly remind all of you that you can submit all your questions at any time during the webinar by using slido.com. We will have one further Q&A session during the webinar later on, and we'll also follow up on any open question in writing in our upcoming clarification notes. As a next point, we will have selected some recurrent questions and will answer them in this webinar. Here, we will look into several questions that have been asked by potential applicants regarding financial mechanisms. One recurrent question seems to be the following. What financial mechanisms and products can be supported by the NSP? Janka, do you mind answering this one?
I'll take this one. Thank you very much. So potential, to make it short, the short answer is potential mechanisms. There's no limitation from the non-facilities side. We don't exclude anything except from covering exchange rate risks. So potential mechanisms do include, but are not limited to, guarantee schemes, soft loans, like concessional loan programs, and also partial grant subsidies, for instance, like results-based payments. These three are in fact the most common mechanisms that are proposed to the NAMA facility so far. The chosen financial mechanism should be the most appropriate, feasible, and efficient mechanism to overcome an identified key barrier. And remember, I mentioned before, not work around the key barrier. All financial mechanisms need to demonstrate that they leverage additional finance from public and private sources, and that the subsidy element does not crowd out any commercial finance that would be already there, but rather that it crowds in commercial finance. Leveraging, or as we also say, mobilizing public and private funds is crucial to make the best use of our limited grant funding provided by the NAMA facility to the NSP to really achieve a relevant scale. And maybe just adding here is, remember that the NAMA facility provides a grant finance to the NSP, and then the NSP is expected to come up with a financial mechanism that leverages the finance. So let me also add, in terms of financial mechanism, if I may, that we also want to see a clear phase-out concept for the financial support mechanism. So we want to understand what happens after the project with the financial mechanism. Does it just cease completely, and then this would be not really in line with our expectation in terms of scale? Or is there some smart phase in of additional funding, crowding in of additional support financing? So we would like to see, in short, a clear phase-out concept for the financial mechanism. And we also recommend that this, if I may, last remark here, we also recommend you to have a look at our webinars on the financial mechanism. We will put the links into this presentation afterwards. And because there you can also see the more details on our expectations and on that topic. And last but not least, for you to get an idea of how different financial mechanisms could actually interplay within one NSP, you might also consider taking a look at our fictional NSP outline that we have been publishing on the fictional case of Tautinir. We have developed that and published on our website.
Okay, thank you, Anka. Another question which comes up a lot is if it is acceptable if the national government is fully involved and committed but cannot directly financially contribute to the NSP funding, but instead contribute in-kind contributions or else. Rita, as this question might be related to the implications of COVID-19, do you mind answering this?
Yeah, sure. So in-kind contributions may be counted. However, a greater weight is given to directly mobilized funds by governments through, be it public sector budgets, funds raised through taxes and exemptions, grants, loans, guarantees, etc. So in the assessment process, the country context and obviously also the implications of COVID-19 in terms of public funds, but also development of financial markets are taken into account.
Okay, thank you, Rita. Some applicants also want to learn more about what kind of information we expect on the degree to which the funding is secured. Janka, could you answer this one?
Oh, sure. So for each distinct direct funding source used for the NSP implementation, including contributions, for instance, from other public institutions, but also private sector or from other donors, we want to learn about what is the degree to which the funding has been secured, and this should be clarified in the NSP outline. So we want to know whether this is, for instance, an existing funding stream, whether this has been firmly committed from the other sources, or whether it is simply earmarked, but has not been, whether it has been simply earmarked, or whether for a very general purpose, or even in principle just agreed, but without any formal commitment at this stage. And then if there's a funding commitment from the government, of course, it would be very useful to have that also mentioned in the endorsement letters. So in short, the more confirmed and secure a financing source is, the better it is, obviously, from our point of view, the more likely it will be really available for the implementation of an NSP.
Okay, thank you, Janka. So next to financial mechanisms, many applicants want to understand more about the eligibility of technologies. One question which is asked quite often is, for example, are technological pilots and research projects eligible for funding? So I will try to answer this myself. Research projects and the piloting of new technologies that are not yet commercially available on the global market are ineligible. Whereas demonstrating an available technology that is new in a certain country context would be considered eligible by us. The NSP would have to demonstrate that it can achieve a relevant scale in the country context during the NSP implementation phase, and a financing mechanism that mobilizes additional financing sources, and that it has a relevant direct and indirect mitigation potential. Another question would be if a sector does have to be mentioned in the NSC. Janka, can you also answer this one?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It does not have to be mentioned in the NDC, or no, let's put it this way. As we mentioned before, we do expect that the NAMA facility supports NSPs that in turn support the implementation of NSPs. But of course, we are aware that not all NDCs include a breakdown to specific sectors for achieving the country's mitigation objectives. And therefore, it would really be facilitating if the course of the NSP, if it can demonstrate the link to the NDC, even in those cases where the NDC does not specify a priority sector. For instance, if the government has meanwhile also detailed out some kind of NDC implementation action plan or roadmap that links to a certain sector. So in general, the NSPs are expected to be linked to the NSP, to the NDC, but we are aware that not all NDCs have included the sectors.
Okay, thank you, Janka. Another question which comes up quite often would be, does the NAMA facility exclude any technologies from support? Rita, would you like to answer this one?
Yes, sure. This requires a more complex response. So, as I mentioned before, the sectors are not constrained by the NAMA facility, so there is no sectoral focus. Therefore, in principle, NSPs from all sectors with the relevant mitigation potential are eligible. It is, however, required to demonstrate that the NSP supports transformational change towards a carbon neutral pathway. So the NAMA facility's interpretation of transformational change encompasses a significant technological paradigm shift that is quicker than business as usual, irreversible, permanent, and that there is also a strong political will and commitment to implement these changes. Janka already mentioned this today earlier on. Therefore, certain technologies targeting a fossil fuel switch, a reduction of gas flaring, upgrading and modernizing fossil fuel-based energy generation, for example, coal, or a replacement of rolling stock in transport with more efficient fossil fuel-based vehicles are likely to find it challenging to demonstrate the potential for transformational change towards a carbon neutral development pathway.
Okay, thank you, Rita. Another topic that always arises many questions is the eligibility of applicants. We will answer some of the more common questions here. One example is the following. Can we submit more than one application, or can we be involved in more than one NSP outline? Janka, could you answer this question?
Yes, and there is a very short answer to this. Yes, this is possible. There's no limit. Ministries and legal entities can be involved in more than one NSP, of course.
Thank you. Another common question is the following. What is the difference between an applicant and an applicant support partner? I will answer this one myself. So the applicant submits the NSP outline to the NAMA facility. The NAMA facility cannot, however, directly contract any national ministries for the DPP due to administrative reasons. If the applicant is a national ministry, then the NAMA facility requires a nomination of an applicant support partner. So that is like a legal entity as the contracting partner for providing the funding support during the DPP. If this legal entity submits the NSP outline itself, the legal entity would be called the applicant. The legal entity would be required to have the endorsement from the relevant national ministries to submit the NSP outline. An additional applicant support partner would not be required. So, and for now, the last question, can the applicant support partner be a consortium? Rita, do you want to answer this question?
Yes, in justified cases, the applicant support partner can be a consortium. The NAMA facility does not set an upper limit to the number of organizations in a consortium, but recommends keeping the number as small as possible. When a consortium is formed, the roles of all partners must, of course, be well defined, and the lead consortium member should be identified to become the contractual partner for the NAMA facility grant agent. This partner is then the funding recipient and can forward the funds to the other consortium partners. In the NSP outline, the consortium partners for the applicant support partner should be described in NSP outline section 1.6 and Annex 3.
Okay, thank you, Rita. So now we have arrived at our final round of Q&As for today. One question that popped up was the following. Is there a need to do a theory of change diagram or objective tree in the NSP outline? Janka, could you answer this one?
Thank you, Johanna, and I'll try to answer this quickly. So no, there is no need to make an explicit theory of change diagram, but you might be aware that the NAMA facility requires a log frame, which is more or less linked to the theory of change. So in Annex, I believe Annex 2, we are expecting a log frame from the applicants.
Okay, thank you, Janka. Maybe one more question for you, as you're the expert on mitigation. Can we replace the format of Annex 5, business model and financial mechanism, and Annex 5, greenhouse gas and mitigation potential with our own formats?
Tricky question. So we would expect that, as a rule, please provide the complete set of application documents based on the template that we have been providing. If, for instance, if you should consider a different format more suitable to present your case, and to present the requested information, then please submit these additionally. Nevertheless, please try to keep the additional information as concise as possible, as you might imagine that we are under big pressure during the assessment time to digest all the information.
Okay, thank you, Janka. One more question. So someone is asking, we read about the Ambition Initiative announced by the UK and Germany last week. How does this relate to the 7th call? Actually, this is also Janka's expertise. Do you mind answering this?
Well, thank you. And I'm happy to hear that someone read the Ambition Initiative has been noted broadly. Indeed, the German Minister Schulze and the British Minister Kwarteng did signal their intention to support a special ambition initiative by the NAMA facility. It is, however, important to understand that the 7th call, and that was the question, what is the difference, or how is it related? So it is important to understand that the 7th call addresses all countries on the ODA list and looks for NSP support for NSPs to support ambitious mitigation actions in a certain sector. In contrast to that, the Ambition Initiative that has been announced now, I would say it aims at recognizing and supports those countries that present an ambitious update of their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So it is also playing right on the political agenda and the UNFCCC agenda. The NAMA Facilities Ambition Initiative will focus on the very critical links, of course, between enhanced climate actions and green recovery from impacts of COVID-19. But remember, it is an ambition initiative and really focuses on those countries that present an ambitious update of their nationally determined contributions.
Okay, thank you, Janka. One more question. Does the NAMA facility recommend a specific tool or guidance for evaluating the additionality of an NSP? Rita, do you mind answering this one?
Yeah, sure. So the answer is no. The NAMA facility does not provide such guidance or recommendations. The applicant should demonstrate why the measures supported by the NAMA facility funding are considered additional to other national or donor-funded initiatives that are being implemented in the same sector, how the additional funding is mobilized, and how a sustainable and transformational impact can be achieved by the NSP. To substantiate its analysis, the applicant may use tools and guidance of other initiatives and funding mechanisms, such as the CDM additionality tool and JEF incremental cost reasoning, but this is not a requirement of the NAMA facility.
Okay, thank you, Rita. We have chosen one more interesting question for now. Someone is asking, can we submit an NSP for a second time if we were not selected in the previous call? So I'm happy to answer this one. So because the answer is yes, certainly. If you consider a resubmission, make sure you take into account the insights we were giving to you during the feedback call, an opportunity which we give to all non-selected applicants. So these details will surely help your resubmission. While there's no preference for resubmitted NSPs, and as a rule, resubmitted outlines are treated the same as new submissions during the assessment, the NAMA facility portfolio of NSPs includes about 14 NSPs by now that were selected after they were resubmitted. So we say, yeah, please do so. And maybe another question we could answer for now is, how does the NAMA facility assess the scalability of NSPs in the context of transformational change? Rita, do you mind answering this one?
Yeah, so during the assessment process, it is evaluated whether upscaling or replication is foreseen at the national or even regional level. It should be clear how the project intends to effect the transformation. including specific activities and/or financial mechanisms that are intended to scale up or replicate the successful impact of the NSP beyond its boundaries.
Okay, thank you, Rita. So maybe one more question for today. Janka, do you mind answering this one? Is the NAMA facility open to applicant organizations that are new to the NAMA facility portfolio?
Well, most definitely, and in fact our NAMA facility donors that are providing the funding for this call have an explicit goal to also attract a growing variety of successful applicants. So yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Janka and Rita, for all those amazing answers. Rita will give you an overview of our important documents now. So, well, the floor is yours, Rita.
Thank you. So before closing this webinar, you will find on this slide a summary of the central documents and information sources you will need for your application. The 7th called General Information document contains detailed information about the NSP outline development process and eligibility criteria, and it is also available in Spanish and French. In addition, clarifications and frequently asked questions are also available on our website. The key documents you will need are, of course, the application documents consisting of an outline template, 6 mandatory annexes, and an optional annex, which is new and which we already explained earlier on. We recommend to also have a look at the monitoring and evaluation framework when preparing your outline. Furthermore, you can have a look at the recordings of the previous webinars. And yeah, we would also like to draw your attention again to the video podcast Janka already mentioned on the Annex 6 mitigation calculations, in which the TSU walks you through how to navigate and fill in Annex 6. And finally, 3 more clarification rounds will still take place before the 7th call closes, where you can submit your questions. And the clarifications will then be published on the 22nd of July, the 25th of August, and the 22nd of September.
Thank you very much. Coming to an end. Please keep in mind that we will send another round of clarification notes in July, August, and September. So please send us your questions if you need more explanation. We are expecting your submissions by 30th of September and are looking forward to read outlines of inspiring projects. All the best and loads of success.